So they're calling for snow in the forecast. Did you
Yeah.
see anything coming up?
Yeah, well, it's snowing right out my window right now, so it's we'll have to see. It was snowing a little bit this morning, and then it stopped. It got sunny, but now there's big flakes coming down. So
Yeah, I saw a couple of flakes when I was out riding this morning, but there's only a couple, so
yeah,
I expected more, but who knows? All right, so we're live on all the platforms, ready to go. So I'm gonna just throw it over you so we can get started. But before I do, everyone who's watching, thanks for attending. You can put your questions wherever you're watching. If you're on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter, just put your comments and questions there, and we can respond to them live. And Jon, if you could do an introduction of who you are before you go to SR&ED, that would be great.
hey, yeah, thanks. Hey guys, thanks everyone for joining. This is definitely my wheelhouse. I'm a software engineer, but I also have almost over 16 years of experience with government funding, specifically with SR&ED, in every industry possible. So I've done where you put a pig in one end and you get fertilizer at the other, different ways to dry rice. It's endless. And so this program is, and we'll dive right into it. So my specialty is government funding, and SR&ED is Canada's largest tax credit program at over $3 billion. But let's start so that we understand where tax credits lie as far as where funds can come from. So I know a lot of you that are listening today probably have a startup or are thinking of a startup or are involved in a company that's a startup or small, medium-sized enterprise. This is typically where different funds come from. First off, there's personal funds, or known as bootstrapping, or friends and family. It's high risk. It requires strict financial discipline and depends on personal status. Equity investment from VCs, angels, private crowdfunding. So you give up ownership, there's share dilution, and you increase the number of stakeholders. Loans, typical loans. There are zero interest loans that the government does offer, but there are very few. That is one of them is the CDAP program, which we will be talking about another day. So tune into that. But risks, there's risk of cash flow issues, repaying the loan. The interest rates are going up. Well, they're staying steady actually right now, but they're still pretty high. And personal guarantees typically are needed from directors. And then what we're talking about today is tax credits. So tax credits, there's no risk of losing equity. It's called non-dilutive or raising debt. And success is based on your eligibility. Now, grants are different. Grants is, again, there's no risk of losing equity for the most part. And success is based on timing and eligibility. And I should add how it's written. So we'll get into that in a second, though, right here. So tax credits versus grants. So what we're talking today is SR&ED, which is a tax credit, which is after the fact. So virtually every grant program will go through a period where applicants exceed available funding. At that point, most of the time, they'll select the winners or choose the ones that have the most promise of providing benefits to Canada, as well as fulfilling the requirements of the program. That's grants. But when it comes to tax credits, it's an entitlement program. The SR&ED tax program is in the Tax Act. It's part of legislation. If you are doing SR&ED eligible work, you are entitled to that money. It reduces your tax liability after the fact. And if you meet the requirements, you get the money. Whereas grants are extremely competitive, especially now. A lot of times you either receive the funds up front, or most of the time you receive them as you go. So you get reimbursed after you spend the money. So it's as you go as opposed to after the fact. And the reason why there's a question mark after meet the requirements, get the money, it's not necessarily a guarantee if you meet all of the requirements. A lot of times there's some hidden agendas, things like that you don't know of. But a lot of times it's who tells the best story kind of thing at the end of the day, and timing as well. So the SR&ED program, it's Canada's largest at over $3 billion. It's a federal tax credit, but there's also each province has its own complementary tax credit that's much lower, but it just kind of aligns. Tax credits go over 20,000 claimants annually. 75% of those are small businesses, and it helps to offset R&D expenditures. It is administered by the CRA, so that's why you claim your SR&ED as part of your tax return when you file your corporate T2 tax. So an example, let's just dive right into it, and we'll talk about, there's two parts to it. There's the technical side and the financial side. I like to give these values right up front, so it sounds a little bit more tantalizing. So if you're a Canadian-owned private company, that means 51% of your shares are owned by Canadian entities, Canadians, PRs, whatever, then these numbers are for you. As long as you're below certain limits, but those limits are ridiculous. So if you have Canadian labor that is eligible for SR&ED, you can expect, after all the calculations and everything, is about 65 cents for every SR&ED eligible dollar. Materials you can expect about, I don't know why that says 42. Sorry, I should have fact checked. It's about 35, 36 for materials and 35 for contractors, and the same for third-party payments. So third-party payments we'll get into, actually we won't, but let's talk about it real quickly. Third-party payments are where you are paying an entity for access to their R&D. And there's a list that the government has of eligible people for third-party payments. It's people like the National Research Council, or any nonprofit that's kind of doing R&D on your behalf. So if you're a potato farmer, there's actually an R&D conglomerate that you can access their research for. So that's just to give you an idea of things. So let's get into the actual calculations just real quick. I'm just going to go through the salary calculations and the contractor calculations just to kind of give you guys a quick overview. So if you had eligible, so let's say you had salaries of $100,000 that were eligible for SR&ED. You get what's called the proxy overhead amount if you use the proxy overhead, and that's 55% of whatever your salaries are. And what that is it's where all of your bills, like your electricity, your HVAC, all of those, internet, all that sort of stuff, it's kind of just lumped in together, and they give you 55% on any salaries claimed. There's another way to claim it, and that's called the traditional method. And that's typically only viable. It's only beneficial if you have no salaries and your claim is primarily contractors, or you're in the manufacturing realm where you have a whole manufacturing line or production line that you have to take down. Typically, that's going to be more beneficial. But one thing to note is if you are claiming traditional for your overhead, you're more likely going to be picked for audit. So you make sure to have all your ducks in a row, make sure it's solid SR&ED if you're going to go with the traditional method as well. Just a breakdown. So we have the salary of $100,000. You add 55% of the eligible expenditures. So your total eligible SR&ED expenditures is $155,000. Doing all the calculations, the Ontario Innovation Tax Credit, the Ontario Research and Development Tax Credit, and the federal ITC. And this is for, again, Canadian companies. If you're a foreign-owned company or you are publicly traded, pretty much these numbers are halved and they become mostly non-refundable. And the reason why I say mostly is because the OITC, the 8%, still remains a refundable tax credit if you're eligible for it. So on $100,000 of salary, you can expect approximately $65,000 in a refundable tax credit. Or, sorry, you can expect about, let's do the math, about $60,000 in refundable tax credit, because the ORDTC is a non-refundable tax credit. So that's the only one that's non-refundable, but these other two are refundable. If you want to get into the complexities of it, if you are filing concurrently within 6 months of your year end, you can waive the non-refundable ORDTC and get all refundable. So you don't get a 65%. It's a little bit less than that, but it becomes all non-refundable. Now, quickly, contractors. Let's say, again, you have $100,000 of expenditures for contractors, Canadian contractors. You don't get the proxy overhead amount, and the CRA has stipulated that you can only claim 80% of your eligible contractor costs for SR&ED. So that eligible SR&ED expenditure becomes $80,000. After all said and done, you can look to get back about $34,000 back on your $100,000 spent. So We can just get into materials real quick, just because materials can be sourced from anywhere in the world. But again, you get 100% of your materials, but you don't get, again, the proxy overhead. So the proxy overhead amount is only on salaries. Even if you go the traditional method, again, traditional method doesn't depend on salaries because you're taking a percentage of your bills. So materials and contractors, you don't get that 55%. But materials, you get 100% of what you claim. You end up about $42,000 after all the calculations are done. So quite lucrative. It is, if not the most lucrative R&D tax credit program in the world. There are, almost every other country has an R&D tax credit program. They're all based off of one big manual called the Frascati Manual for Performing R&D. It's about 300 pages. It's a great read if you want to fall asleep at night, but it does have some great information. But it is the most strict, and we'll get into why in a second. So this, just to kind of get into the technical side of things, the CRA, quite a few years ago, they came out with a method to test eligibility for SR&ED called the 5 questions. It's still in use, but not officially in use. But it is a good measure for evaluating SR&ED eligibility. So these are the questions from the CRA, and I'm going to go to in the next slide, I'll put them in more layman's terms for you. But was there scientific or technological uncertainty? Did the effort involve formulating hypotheses? Was the overall approach adopted consistent with a systematic investigation or search? Was the overall approach undertaken for the purpose of achieving a scientific or technological advancement? And was a record of the hypotheses tested and results kept as the work progressed? So the first question, was there a scientific or technological uncertainty? That's essentially, what was the problem? Okay. What was the problem that you were trying to solve that you were uncertain you could solve? Second, did the effort involve formulating hypotheses? What did you try? So think back to your grade 9, grade 10 science. You come up with a hypothesis that's going to attempt to resolve your problem. The third is, was the overall approach adopted consistent with a systematic investigation? Again, grade 9, grade 10 science, you have a problem, you come up with a hypothesis, and you test your hypothesis systematically. You do this, you learn from this, you learn from that. So it's a systematic investigation. So what was the outcome of your attempts is that question. 4, was the overall approach undertaken for the purpose of achieving a scientific or technological advancement? Did it succeed or fail? And this is a good point to just pause for a second. Failures are great indicators of SR&ED. Even if the project itself wasn't successful and you had to abandon it, there's probably more than likely going to be SR&ED eligibility in that project. So did it succeed or fail? What did you learn? And the last one was a record of hypotheses tested. How did you keep track of your work? Documentation. And I'll give you some examples of that in a second. Now that we've talked about the old 5 questions that are still kind of being used, but unofficially, there's a new way there's a new Jason Charon, who's a phenomenal guy. When he became head of the SR&ED program for the CRA, he made some positive changes that are positive for the taxpayers. This is one of them, the why and the how. So this is the new criteria that the CRA is supposed to be using to evaluate SR&ED claims. It makes it much more it's not easier, but more clear as to what the taxpayers should be, how the taxpayers are being evaluated. So the work conducted must be for the advancement of scientific knowledge or technological advancement. The key is to generate and discover knowledge that advances science or technology. So the why is, why are you doing this? And what it's more focused on the knowledge that you're attempting to gain, as opposed to overcoming a technological uncertainty and trying to show that there was uncertainty, if that makes sense. So attempting to resolve scientific or technological uncertainty marks the starting point of the SR&ED work, with the advancement as the target outcome. So what you must do is you must try to resolve the uncertainty and generate new knowledge for the work to meet the why requirement. So if there's no uncertainty, so here's the thing. If there's no uncertainty, then it's likely not going to take you very long to complete that project. So if you run into problems, if you run into uncertainties, then that's where there's potential for SR&ED. So the success or failure in meeting your objectives is not relevant. When assessing whether your work meets the why requirement. It's just that you have to be advancing your knowledge and advancing technology in that's not available in the public domain. So the next part is the how criteria. The how is, again, it's think back to your grade 9, grade 10 science. It's the systematic approach. So work must be a systematic investigation or search. You can't be throwing darts blindly at a dartboard. You have to be, if I can give you an example, you try something. From that attempt, it either succeeds or fails. If it fails, you're going to learn from that failure and you're going to try something else based on that first attempt, instead of just trying things one willy-nilly without any kind of idea of how you're going to do it. Like at the end of the day, if you look back, a lot of people are going to say, oh yeah, we just did trial and error. But if you look back to how you went about it and the steps that you undertook, a lot of times it is a systematic investigation. You just don't realize it when you're doing it. So that's the why and the how. That makes it much easier. It's more focused on the knowledge gained and how you gain that knowledge, as opposed to this uncertainty and resolving the uncertainty and all that sort of stuff. So when I talked about the SR&ED being an R&D tax credit program, it's a critical point because SR&ED is not R&D. R&D is SR&ED, but SR&ED is not R&D. So R&D is a broad category of activities and related costs, which often include market research and analysis, product development, packaging, consumer testing, all the way through to launch. The only part of that essentially would be eligible for SR&ED is analysis, product development, maybe some consumer testing, as long as you still are having problems in development. But any kind of due diligence or any kind of commercialization, not eligible for SR&ED. So if you have your R&D project, SR&ED is a subset of your R&D project. Very simple way to determine SR&ED eligibility. It's the same way the CRA does it, in the same way that I do it with my clients. First, we determine if there's SR&ED, because if there's no SR&ED, there's no sense in determining how much SR&ED there is. So step one is determining, is there SR&ED? The second one is determining how much of that SR&ED is eligible to be claimed. And that's those costs. That's the salaries, the contractors, the materials, and third-party payments. This is, as you go through it, you can just go back to this. This is just a fancy graphic that I put together to kind of show the grade 9, grade 10 process, scientific process. So you have an uncertainty, you have your hypothesis, you test your hypothesis, and you draw results. So this is just shows you in a nice fancy graphic kind of the process or the scientific method kind of thing. Again, so we talked about your SR&ED project. We talked about your R&D project. We talked about your SR&ED project. Even bigger than your R&D project is your company project. So company project, and this is where a lot of clients will talk. This is the level that they'll talk about, which is fine because that's where they're at. That's where their head is at. But a SR&ED project is a subset of the R&D project, which is a subset of the company project. So company project is a generic term referring to undertakings by a company to have an impact on its business. For example, building new facilities, expanding facilities, developing new products and product lines. But it all comes down to how is that going to help the business. SR&ED is not about how does it help the business. SR&ED is about how does it advance science? How does it advance knowledge? So it's a subset. Now I'm going to give you some tips on how to identify eligible work. Here are some questions that you can ask. What technical challenges or constraints were faced in meeting the sought objectives? How did your current knowledge base limit your ability to achieve the sought objectives? Did you do design, development, testing, and what did that look like, and what was done along the way? What failed? Again, failures, great indicators of SR&ED. What new ideas were formulated? How did the work evolve? And again, that's the systematic investigation. And then what were the results and things learned along the way? By understanding the facts, like as in what work was done, we can evaluate SR&ED eligibility. Here are some examples of potential eligible SR&ED projects in the ITCS industries. I'm not going to go through them line by line, but this is a good reference for you. If you have projects that relate to any of these, feel free to reach out or go to the CRA's website and read up on SR&ED. You can make your own claims if you'd like, and we'll get into that after. You can put together your own claims if you like. So performance issues, data centralization, system integration, platform independence. There's a whole bunch of different ones. These are questions that I've used throughout the years to kind of get information from clients. These are ones that you can ask yourself or ask your team in order to determine whether or not they're SR&ED. Now, just because there's answers to these questions doesn't necessarily mean that they're SR&ED eligible work. So just a note for those that just because you have an answer for all 16 questions doesn't necessarily mean there's a good chance. But again, there's no magic silver bullet to say yes or no, there's SR&ED eligibility. It's on a case-by-case basis when it comes to SR&ED eligibility. So did you use third-party tools in a way they were not intended? That's a good one, because a lot of people are using libraries, third-party tools, open source. But if you're using them in ways that are not intended to be used, there's likely some SR&ED eligibility there. Did you investigate or test several alternative solutions? Did you adapt a known technology for a different application other than its original intent or usage? Craig, correct me if I'm wrong. We might be able to provide this slide deck after. I'm not sure, but
absolutely, we can have it posted.
Sure.
But because just message me. I'll post it somewhere, and I'll share the link in the YouTube.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, these are good slides for reference. I always put them in. I just touch on them. But yeah, screenshot it if you can, or reach out and we'll send it to you after. This is, so again, like I said, SR&ED can be in any industry. Here are some potential eligible projects for manufacturing. Weld dissimilar metals that are normally incompatible, prevent warping or deformation of metal when high temperature welding. And these are very basic ones, but there's some examples here. So when this is a critical part, and the CRA is really, really focusing on this nowadays, is supporting documentation. It is a requirement. You must have supporting documentation. I can help identify what you have that might be eligible or might be useful, what you might not have, what you should have, different things like that. But here are some examples. So traditional sources like project plans, design docs, functional specs, test plans, test results, presentations, trial reports. Those are really good. If you have emails, text messages, chat logs, Slack, GitHub, things like that, change, sprint, or problem tickets like Jira or Confluence, check-in logs, revision source code. Sorry, there's the Git or TFS, different things like that. Time tracking is really good to have. You don't have to have it on a daily basis, but it is good if you can do it on a task basis, on a bi-weekly basis is good. But yeah, those are just some examples. If you want more or you want me to review anything, I'm happy to do that. In summary, and these are some really key points, so pay attention to this. SR&ED can be filed every tax year where you have eligibility. A SR&ED project can span multiple fiscal years, but there is a limit to that before a red flag is raised. You can put together a SR&ED claim yourself. There are tools out there. CRA provides a lot of tools, but using a consultant will help you to avoid an audit and help you to avoid, not guarantee, because the CRA does ensure that they look at every claim at least once every 5 to 7 years. It might actually be even 3 to 5 now. But in the case of an audit, a consultant will give you your best chance at success. Think of consultants like lawyers when you're talking to the police. We know what you can and can't say, or what you should and should not say. We've got strategies on different approaches based on the reviewers or the auditors. So the reason why I really stress about that is because if you fail an audit, you will be flagged for multiple subsequent years. And that's even if you're successful, it could still be considered a failure. And the threshold is typically if you get 50% or less of your claim, that's typically considered still a failure to the CRA, and they will flag you for multiple years. They could. You have up to 18 months after your year end to file a SR&ED claim. So you can't go back 3 or 4 fiscal years. Typically, you can file 2 fiscal years. That's the maximum you can capture. First-time claimants, if you're filing SR&ED for the first time, they're given slightly more leniency when it comes to supporting documentation, but you should always strive to document as much as you can. Thank you. Questions? I think we have some questions, Craig.
Yes, we do. Can we apply for SR&ED if we're making TV shows, movies, using new techniques for special effects or process?
Absolutely, you can. Especially if you're using or if you're developing those new techniques, or you're using those new techniques in ways that they weren't supposed to be used, or you're pushing the limitations. There's also film tax credits as well that we can, Craig, you and I can do a thing on. But there's the digital media tax credit, which is for video games and educational for children under 12. But there's also film tax credits as well, specifically for production and things like that. We can certainly have a conversation about that further. But yes, long story short, you can, as long as you are the one developing the new techniques and you're the one that owns the IP, or that you have the knowledge that you're gaining. You're not just using new techniques and it works kind of thing. So again, back to the test. If you just find a new technique, you learn about it. After the learning curve, you implement it and it just works, then there's no SR&ED there. But if you implement it and you have lots of problems, you have to try different things, then there's potentially SR&ED eligibility there.
Great. This next one is, what about a startup working on algae-based food? Would the research around that qualify?
Yeah, potentially, yes. Again, it all comes down to, and I didn't touch on this too much in depth, but the threshold for knowledge gained is what's available in the public domain, but also what is available to you as a company. So if your knowledge level, base knowledge, is above what's available in the public domain, then that's what the CRA is going to use as kind of like their base for you for knowledge gained. But if you are advancing knowledge, you don't have the knowledge, and you're advancing what's available in the public domain, then there is good likely that there's going to be eligibility for algae-based food development for sure. The one thing to note is, and I like that you're saying algae-based food and not gluten-free or keto or anything like that, because the threshold for, not the threshold, but claiming food and beverage can be tricky, because CRA likes to see metrics. And so when you're developing a new recipe, right, you're like, oh, it tastes good or it doesn't. So if I can give one piece of advice to that is, make sure that you're using metrics to evaluate your success, either saltiness or different things like that, shelf life, things like that. Those are good. Good metrics to use. I know a startup doing a new hardware software combo for monitors. Does both hardware and software development qualify? Potentially. Oh, okay. Sorry, go ahead, Gary.
I was just saying, under that particular situation, could that startup qualify for both?
Potentially. And the reason why I say potentially is, then the scenario where it wouldn't is if the new hardware, they're just buying it from overseas and they're just using it in the way that the hardware is supposed to be used, then likely not. But again, this is actually a good question, because it all depends on how you frame the SR&ED project. And this is where consultants can help too, is if you frame it as a software project, then likely the hardware might have to have its own project and it might not be eligible. because of the work that you're doing. If you frame the shred project as a hardware software combo, where you take it up a slightly above a level above the software and hardware, then you can probably capture both the hardware and the software side, even if the hardware might not be eligible on its own, if that makes sense. Or the software, if it's not eligible on its own. This is where the strategies come in and things like that.
Fabulous. We got another one coming in here. Can you explain the process of applying for SR&ED funding?
Sure. So yeah, it's not so much of applying for it. It's more of filing a claim for it, if that makes sense. So the way that most consultants will approach it is they'll have a kickoff. They'll gather the tech. They'll have a kickoff, set up milestones and due dates, set up interviews for the technical people to gather the technical information, reach out to the financial people to gather the financial information. Once they identify if they're SR&ED, then they quantify it by saying, okay, these are the people that worked on it. Here's the percentages of people. Then they get the salaries and the cost and all that from the financial person. Then they put together the SR&ED claim. A good consultant will provide the tax schedules to the accountant, which reduces your cost when the accountant has to file SR&ED, and all of the subsequent supporting documentation. A more junior consultant will just provide the write-up and costs and things like that. So just when you're picking your consultant, make sure you're picking a good one that's not going to make you pay a lot more for your accountant to file SR&ED. But at the end of the day, your accountant files the amended or your tax return, so they have to coordinate with your accountant.
Fantastic. So the next one here, are there recent changes or updates to the SR&ED program that we should be aware of?
No recent changes, but beware, there are going to be some changes. The government has announced that they are reviewing the SR&ED program as of this year, 2024. So we're going to have to see what that is. Last time they did this, we had those 5 questions, which made it just much more difficult for people to claim SR&ED. So we're going to have to see. Every time they've made a change, it's been more detrimental to the taxpayer. When they made a change before, they got rid of capital expenditures, so you couldn't claim, you could no longer claim servers and laptops and things like that. So we'll have to see. Hopefully, I'm hoping there's going to be positive changes this time, because Canada is so low. Well, not low, but yeah, I would say so low on the innovation index, global innovation index.
For biotech startups, what specific documentation or evidence is required to substantiate SR&ED claims related to the research and development in the life sciences field?
Yeah, so for biotech startups, it can be, so a lot of times you don't want to introduce processes that are going to make things more difficult. So what I would say is, you want to look at what you currently have, and you want to get someone to evaluate that to see what you can currently use. But if I'm going to give you some specific examples, you're going to look at probably lab notes, or any kind of notes that speak to any kind of metrics that you're tracking for the biotech stuff. And from the technical side, you're going to have probably emails. You're going to have tickets. You're going to have epics or stories. Potentially, you're going to have maybe Slack chat. Maybe anything like any kind of the new platforms where people are collaborating. It could be anything from Teams, anything like that. So a lot of times when we're talking bio, or we're talking pharma or things like that, a lot of the people doing the R&D are old school, and they'll write in their lab books. And so you're going to want to keep copies of that. You're going to want to take pictures or videos of any progress that you're having, any scrap materials. You want to keep track of things like that. So hopefully that answers it without getting too specific. But yeah, again, if I can just caveat that again, it all depends on what processes you currently have as well. Like there are things that I'm not listing that you might have that might be able to be used, might be useful.
How does the SR&ED program support software startups, especially those focused on cutting edge technologies like AI or blockchain?
Yeah. So the good thing about shred is it doesn't discriminate. The bad thing about shred is it doesn't discriminate. So it doesn't matter what technology you're developing. Like there are, so if I can compare that to grants, there are grants that are specific to AI and blockchain and things like, well, not so much blockchain, but AI, where it's going to be heavily focused on that specific technology, and there's going to be a lot of criteria and very complex. Whereas shred, it doesn't matter what you're developing, as long as you are advancing your knowledge and overcoming uncertainties. Now, one thing to note, the good thing about shred is that you can file it in your first year. You don't have to have any revenue to be eligible for shred. All you have to do is have expenses. And you're like, well, how do I have expenses without revenue? Well, if you're bootstrapping, if you have investments, like you don't have to have any sales. You don't have, there's a very low threshold for companies to claim shred. As long as you have expenditures that are eligible, you can claim shred, and you can claim it in your first year. Whereas grants, sometimes you have to be incorporated for at least 2 years, have some income, have sales, different things like that, and employees. So
for fintech startups, how does SR&ED program incentivize innovation in financial technology?
Yeah. So again, that's good. I can give an example: big data analytics in fintech. So there's fintechs who. So again, if you're developing a system where you're uncertain whether or not you can do it, you have to build your own custom software. You have to integrate into systems that don't have APIs or anything like that. Or you have different performance metrics. Like if you're developing, for example, a trading platform, and you can figure out the latency, get the latency down to 0.00 nanoseconds or something. There are there's a plethora of different types of projects and that are supported. But again, it's not so much fintech. It's more, again, it's around the technology itself. It's not the product itself, if that makes sense. So it's about the underlying technology, the advancement of the underlying technology, and the integration of it as well.
In the food and beverage sector, what type of research and development activities qualify? And how do you demonstrate the technological advancements?
So it's more along the lines of the processes. So you can be developing recipes, okay, and you can be eligible for shred, but just be cautious that there is uncertainty. So I know, I can give you an example. There was a company who was producing cheese in another country. They wanted to produce the same cheese in Canada, but because our water's different, because of a bunch of different things, they weren't able to produce the same amount or volume or things like that. So they had to redevelop the recipes for Canada. So there's where some shred eligibility would be. If you're developing a kombucha beer, there's potential shred eligibility. Again, make sure that you're making it scientific, though, that you have metrics that you can measure to ensure success, because the CRA is going to want to see the advancement of knowledge. So at the end of the day, it's what new knowledge have you developed, if that makes sense.
How can startups in fashion and design industry leverage shred funding?
Textiles. So textiles, this is one that I haven't really done too many shred claims in, but if you're developing a new bulletproof material, if you are coming up with a new way to produce garments that reduce the cost and are automated processes, but again, it has to be new processes that are seen as an advancement. So the test that you could do is, if you were to bring this to someone in your field, would they say, oh, that's a really cool way to do that? I never thought about doing that before. So that's one example. If you're trying to develop weatherproof garments and things like that, again, it's got to be where you're advancing the knowledge. So you can't just be buying the material and making them. This is a good one to bring up. So if you're not an expert in the textile field in fashion and design, and you're learning it, and you're running into problems learning it, there's no shred eligibility there. You have to be someone who's in the field. The shred has to be done by someone who is knowledgeable in that realm. And so you must ensure that the learning curve, that you're up to par with what's available, again, in the public domain. Oh, Craig, you're on mute.
Sorry, when I was typing here, sometimes what opportunities for SR&ED are in innovative projects related to environmental tech, I guess, pollution control, waste management, sustainable resource? Because I think a lot of these questions are coming from non-traditional industries that people say, okay, I'm a food startup. What qualifies? I'm okay, I'm doing this cool stuff with waste management, but like, does that qualify?
It potentially does. Again, it comes down to, what are you developing? Are you developing something that someone else already has? And this is a good point. If someone else has already developed that process, but it's not, the knowledge of how they did it is not available in the public domain, then you could potentially claim shred, because the way that you're going to develop it is going to be different than the way that other person developed it. So if it's an advancement, even though it's available by another company, it doesn't matter, as long as it's an advancement to your company and it's not, the information on how to do it is not available in the public domain. So again, it could be developing new processes, coming up with new filtration, anything that would be new or innovative, if that makes sense.
I think people need to talk to someone like yourself about each of these individual types of things, because there's a lot. You just need to think about it in a certain way to figure out, okay, what is it we're learning here? What is new? For startups in the entertainment and media production sector, how can SR&ED funding help support in content creation? We talked about special effects before, about distribution platforms or audience engagement strategies.
Yeah, if you're broadcasting, multicasting, you could have a lot of issues with that. As far as bandwidth goes, you could have limitations. So there are other tax credits for production and things like that, if it's not innovative production, if it's just media production sector that's not innovative. So we can have a conversation about that. That's the CMF, Canada Media Fund. Yeah, so as far as audience engagement strategies, there could be potential shred there if you're developing some AI stuff. But again, it has to be innovative. It has to be new. It can't be available in the public domain. And it can't be workflows. So one thing to note is workflows, CRA does not like workflows, and they don't like algorithms unless it's machine learning algorithms. So that's one thing to note when it comes to any kind of audience engagement strategies and things like that.
Yeah, we're really putting you on the spot with all these today. What about transportation and logistics?
For sure. So when I said CRA doesn't like algorithms, logistics is about algorithms. But again, it's how you frame the project. So the metric would be maybe reducing shipping time down from 24 hours to 23 hours. And so the algorithm is one small portion of that whole supply chain process. So implementing autonomous vehicles, 100%, there's going to be shred eligibility there. Drones and things like that. As long as you're just not as long as, again, you're doing innovative stuff with that, you're advancing knowledge that's not available in the public domain. Sustainable transportation solutions, potentially, I would say less than others, but yeah.
Okay, what about, we talked about the gaming a little bit, I think. The gaming interactive media. What specific aspects of game development are eligible?
Sure.
And how do you document them?
The more eligible gaming stuff is more along the lines of VR, AR, XR kind of development. Again, it's got to be new techniques, new processes that aren't currently known in the gaming industry. But if you are just building a video game that's regular, there is a great tax credit for that. It's called the Interactive Digital Media Tax Credit. There's one in almost every province. But if you are doing stuff that's innovative, then again, gaming is specific because they have another tax credit for it. So you have to be really cautious about what you're claiming. But like if you're building reusable assets, if you're using physics in a certain way that hasn't been used and different things like that, there is a lot of potential for SR&ED eligibility in the gaming and interactive digital media. So, yeah.
All right. This next one here is digital health and medical technologies, particular in terms of you can use SR&ED for regulatory requirements and clinical trials.
Yeah, so you can use it for clinical trials as long as you meet all the criteria from Health Canada. You have the go ahead to do that. The other thing is new protocols are eligible. Like if you're developing new protocols, learning platforms, if we're talking like learning management solutions, not so much. Those were eligible, but now there's so many out there. So you really have to be pushing the boundaries for that. Educational content too. Educational content might fall into the digital media tax credit if it's educational, if it can be considered educational for children under 12. Oh, sorry, I'm reading the wrong question. So MedTech regulatory requirements, no. Okay. Adhering to regulatory requirements is not eligible for SR&ED because all you're doing is you're working towards a target, but as part of a larger SR&ED project, potentially, and we can have that conversation. The other thing to think about too is if you're a medical professional, like a doctor or a dentist, and you're developing new protocols, there actually is a stream called the medical professionals, MPCs, medical professional corporations, where you can claim SR&ED for some of the work that you're doing in your clinic if you're doing some stuff. Yeah.
Now, the one you were partially answering, what about the EdTech sector?
Yeah, so EdTech, not so much, unless, again, maybe you're building something for the Vision Pro or things like that, where, again, it would come down to new knowledge advancement and innovation. So there's a lot of learning management platforms out there. If you're just building learning solutions without any challenges, it's pretty straightforward. There's likely no SR&ED there. If you're building courses, there's probably you're not going to be SR&ED eligible. Content and things like that, not so much.
All right, we only got time for a couple of more, and I'm sure you probably run out of water. We're making you talk so much here. In telecom, what specific research and development?
Yeah. So telecom, so 6G. I know we're like, what? 6G?
We're talking about
yeah. Development of 6G technology is currently underway, but even the 5G stuff, there's still tons of stuff being done in 5G. That's the telecom is more the RF signals, RF propagation signals, things like that. If you're developing a new cell phone, there's potential there if you're pushing the limits. If you're building a new if you're developing modems or things like that, it's more specific for like if you're building technology. Think about it like this: if you're building technology that Bell or Rogers would use, like fiber modems, fiber routers, things like that. Like we're talking some really high tech, but also satellite technology as well. If you're looking at waveguides and developing waveguides and things like that. So there's a lot in the telecom, but it's more advanced than I would say than other industries.
And how can they demonstrate technological advancements in communication, and like how do you prove that we're doing stuff? But
yeah, so I'll use the BlackBerry example. So I don't know those of you who watched the BlackBerry movie, but when they first developed BBM, BlackBerry Messenger, and they deployed it, they were running into issues. They couldn't handle too many people. So they had to develop their own technology, their own protocols in order to handle more users. And that would be an example, an advancement. If in communication, so if you're building a communication platform that's more secure than what's out there, there's potential there depending on the encryption that you're using and that sort of stuff. But it all comes down to metrics, performance metrics, latency, different things like that. So network infrastructure, again, latency is a good one, or bandwidth or things like that. So those are good measures for advancement. Again, you have to be measuring it against something too. So it can't just be, yeah, I want to achieve 1 terabyte throughput on coaxial cable. You have to have some basis for how you want to achieve that. So.
And last one we're going to take here is talking about sports equipment. How can you demonstrate innovation in this? Performance tracking, athlete training technologies, like a lighter, I know, shoulder pads for hockey.
Yeah, there's actually a cool one that when I buy for my skis, there's an insole that you put in that tracks your turning and all that sort of stuff. So the metrics and the science, the sports science behind it would be eligible. The development of the pad itself, probably, because you've got sensors in the pad and the tracking and all that sort of stuff. So there's a good thing. Golf technologies is huge as far as drivers and irons and different things like that. Athlete training technologies, 100% potentially. If we're talking like I know there's a mirror that can track your movements and your exercises that you're doing and give you feedback. That's SR&ED eligible. And definitely performance tracking systems. Now, like say you want to build a Galaxy ring or an Oura ring. But again, you have to look at the work itself. Again, it all comes down to, it's not so much, again, think about it. It's not so much the product when I'm talking about it. It's the technology underlying it that's supporting it that we have to look at from a SR&ED perspective. These are great questions. Jeez. Really challenged my brain.
You got a lot going on. If people want to get a hold of you and talk about their SR&ED claims, where should they go? What should they do?
LinkedIn is the best way, and you can find things that you and I are doing together, that I'm posting, that you're posting, lots of events, different things like that. But send me a message on LinkedIn. That's your best way. I check that on a daily basis for the most part, unless I'm away at a conference. But yeah, I'm pretty good at responding. So LinkedIn is your best way. And you got a couple of things going on? Yeah, so I'm a judge for the Future Business Leaders of America. There's CNLC conference coming up on February 25th. And that's going to be interesting. Judging, just went through the training. Going to be judging business cases. So it's going to be interesting to see how they do. So maybe we'll get you involved next year, Craig. It's kind of fun. Looks fun.
Yeah, some of those are fun.
Yeah. And then on the 21st, is it next week? Jesus, next week already. I will be taking part in a roundtable with two other phenomenal people. We're going to be talking HR, branding, and funding at Creator Club on King Street. And I wish those links are displayed here when he was talking about them. For those who are watching, we do a co-founder matchup downtown Toronto tomorrow, February 14th from 6 to 8:30. Go to mentoringmagic.ca. Everything else, go to TorontoStarts.com. We have all sorts of stuff going on. But thank you for the time today, Jon. We had some great questions. And we'll talk soon. For sure. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Craig.